Beneath the thunderous applause, Eleanor merely smiled faintly, a gentle smile, no longer burdened by the wounds of the past. There was a time when every compliment felt like a blade twisting into the scars she kept hidden. But today, amidst the loving gazes of her family and friends, she understood. Those scars were not meant to be forgotten, but to be remembered, as proof that she had overcome. She raised her glass, her gaze lingering on each familiar face. "Fate cannot erase what has happened," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But it gives us the strength to write a new chapter, stronger and brighter." Those words were not a declaration, but the culmination of a journey of growth. As the glasses gently clinked, Eleanor knew. A new beginning was arriving, not through forgetting, but with a heart that had learned to heal itself. And that was the conclusion to the story of Eleanor, the woman who was once hurt, betrayed, and abandoned, but who ultimately stood up, found justice, in her own time. What about you? Would you forgive Ethan? Do you think Victoria will return? Life always has unexpected turns, and Eleanor has taught us that no one can escape destiny, but we can choose how to face it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite part was, and share. What ending would you choose for Victoria? Thank you for watching to the very end. See you in the next stories, where emotions are always given a voice. The rain beat furiously against the ground. Puddles on the sidewalk reflected the flickering lights of the lampposts, distorting the shadow of a woman who could barely stay on her feet. Eleanor clutched her suitcase tightly, her only possession at that moment. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of disbelief, fear, and pain. In front of her, the door to the house where she had lived for over 4 decades slammed shut with a final, heavy thud. "Ethan," her broken voice was lost in the thunder. "Please, son, open the door." The old woman pounded on the door with her knuckles, not caring that the wet wood scraped her skin. The cold seeped into her bones, but what hurt most was the indifference of the son she had raised with so much love. From inside, the murmurs were barely audible, but the impatient tone of Victoria, her daughter-in-law, cut through the walls with ease. "Leave her, honey. Don't push it. It's for the best." Eleanor felt a stab in her chest. "Please, son. I gave you life. I raised you. I gave you everything." There was a silence, and for a moment, she thought Ethan would open the door. Her heart clung to that hope, but the only thing she heard was his muffled, emotionless voice. "Mom, it's better this way." A metallic click. The deadbolt. The sound was like a sentence. Eleanor took a step back, feeling her entire world crumble. The rain fell mercilessly, soaking her worn clothes. Her blue cardigan clung to her skin, splattered with mud and tears. Her messy, wet white hair stuck to her forehead as if trying to hide her eyes, but it couldn't hide the pain reflected in them. Footsteps were heard behind the window. Victoria pulled back the curtain with a triumphant look on her face. "Finally, that old hag is out of our lives." Victoria's laughter echoed in the house, and although the storm nearly drowned it out, Eleanor felt it like knives sinking into her back. With trembling hands, she lifted her suitcase and held it against her chest. She felt weak, as if all the energy had been drained from her body. Her home, her refuge, everything she had built with effort over the years had been snatched away in minutes. Why? Eleanor stood in front of the house for a few more minutes, hoping that Ethan would open the door, that he would regret it, that he would tell her it was all a cruel joke. But there was no movement on the other side. With a trembling sigh, she looked down and began to walk. Her steps were slow, heavy. The streets that once seemed familiar now felt hostile. The lights of the houses flickered in the distance. Through some windows, she could see families gathered in the warmth of their homes, tables set with hot food, laughter, hugs. Eleanor swallowed hard. She no longer had a home. She stopped for a moment at the corner, leaning against a lamppost. Water dripped from her hair, running down her face as if the rain itself were crying with her. She looked up and saw the gray sky, the thick clouds hiding the stars. "Why, God? What did I do to deserve this?" she whispered, but no one answered. Her mind traveled to the past. Ethan, barely 5 years old, hugging her after a nightmare. Ethan at 10, running home with a scraped knee and crying in her arms. Ethan at 18, proud with his high school diploma in his hand, telling her, "Mom, I did it, thanks to you." Where had that boy gone? When did her son become a man capable of throwing his own mother out onto the street? A car passed by, splashing her with dirty water. She didn't bother to move. The mud on her slacks was the least of her worries. She kept walking. She thought about going to her sister's house, but the distance felt immense. Grace lived all the way in Arizona, and Eleanor had no way to get there. She thought about calling her friend Dorothy, but she realized she didn't have her number. She put her hand in her purse with trembling fingers and pulled out her wallet, only a few dollars and some change. She sat on a park bench, her bones stiff from the cold. She tried to find a comfortable position, but her back ached, and the icy wind made her shiver. Time passed slowly. The rain continued to fall, though less intensely now. In the distance, she heard a couple arguing. Further away, a group of teenagers laughed. The lives of others went on as if nothing had happened, as if her tragedy was insignificant to the rest of the world. A stray cat ran past her, seeking shelter from the storm. Eleanor watched it, feeling they had something in common. Both had been abandoned. She didn't know how long she sat there, motionless. Her numb fingers caressed the suitcase as if it were the only thing keeping her connected to reality. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her body begged for rest, but her mind was on fire. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't give up. She took a deep breath and forced herself to stand up. Her legs trembled, but she took one step, then another. Maybe Dorothy still lived at the same address. Maybe. She clung to that small hope and moved forward, her back bent by the weight of the years and sadness. The city lights seemed to mock her from a distance, but Eleanor didn't look back. There was nothing behind her anymore. What now? Why did Ethan make such a cruel decision? Will he ever regret it? If you want to find out what happens to Eleanor in this story full of unexpected twists, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and comment on where you're watching from. The storm is just beginning, and in the next chapters, there will be more tension, revelations, and intense emotions. Don't miss it. The rain had lessened, but the cold lingered. Eleanor walked slowly through the wet streets, feeling her soaked clothes stick to her skin. The suitcase in her hand seemed to get heavier and heavier, although inside it only held a few changes of clothes and some memories of a life that, until a few hours ago, she had believed was stable. But now, she had nothing. She stopped under a small awning in front of a closed shop. She rested her suitcase on the ground and hugged herself, trying to preserve some warmth. Her feet, inside the old sneakers, were soaked and freezing. She thought of her sister, Grace. But she lived in Arizona. She thought of Lisa, her niece, but the last time she saw her, she had made it clear that she had no room for anyone else in her life. She bit her lower lip, feeling a tightness in her chest. Since when had she become a burden, a problem everyone wanted to avoid? The smell of freshly baked donuts wafted from the corner. She closed her eyes, and the image appeared clearly in her mind. Ethan, barely 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting anxiously while she took the chocolate chip cookies out of the oven. "Mom, are they ready yet?" "They're still hot, my love. But I'm hungry. If you wait 5 minutes, they'll taste even better." The little boy looked at her with a frown, crossing his arms impatiently. Eleanor smiled, coming closer to affectionately ruffle his hair. "Better yet, I'll pour you a glass of milk while you wait." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. The image vanished with the sound of a car speeding by, splashing dirty water on the sidewalk. Eleanor opened her eyes, and reality hit her hard. Her son wasn't there. There was no warm kitchen, no cookies. The only thing she had was the icy wind and the hunger that was starting to gnaw at her stomach. She took a deep breath and started walking again. She approached an apartment building and rang the buzzer. "Yes?" An impatient voice answered through the intercom. "Excuse me, sir. My name is Eleanor. Could you let me in for a moment? I just want to rest in the lobby. It's cold, and I have nowhere to go." There was an awkward silence before the voice replied, "Sorry, ma'am. This isn't a shelter." The sound of the intercom cutting off was as loud in her head as Ethan's slamming door had been. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold back the tears. She tried another house, then another, and another. All the responses were the same. "Sorry, we can't help you. We can't let anyone in. We don't have any space." Some people didn't even open the door. Others looked at her with pity but did nothing. She kept walking until she reached the small neighborhood park. She saw a wooden bench under the dim light of a lamppost. Her legs couldn't take it anymore, so she collapsed onto it, letting out an exhausted sigh. She looked at the city around her. A group of young people walked by, laughing, oblivious to her suffering. A couple walked arm in arm under an umbrella. She was alone. The wind blew harder, making her wet clothes stick even closer to her skin. She hugged herself, trembling from the cold. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. She opened it with numb fingers. 3 $1 bills, not even enough for a coffee. A sob escaped her throat. She covered her face with her hands and let the tears flow. She was tired, exhausted from being strong, from fighting, from moving forward when the whole world seemed to turn its back on her. The wind rustled the dry leaves in the park, pulling her from her memory. She looked at her reflection in a nearby puddle. Her face was weathered, marked by the years and the pain. Her white hair was stuck to her cheeks. She was a shadow of the woman she once was. For the first time in her life, she felt she couldn't go on. The hunger, the exhaustion, the sadness, it was all too much. She lowered her gaze, defeated. Maybe this was her fate. Maybe, after all, there was no hope. The icy wind blew through the deserted streets, making Eleanor shiver. The wooden bench in the small park was damp and hard, but she no longer had the strength to keep walking. Her clothes were still soaked, clinging to her thin body like a reminder of her misery. She hugged herself, trying to conserve a little warmth, but the cold wasn't just on her skin, it was inside her. Around her, the city went on as if nothing had happened. The headlights of cars illuminated her hunched figure. In the distance, a group of young people laughed as they walked without a care. For them, tonight was just another night. For her, it was the worst day of her life. Eleanor closed her eyes, her head bowed, and let out a choked sigh. She couldn't stay there. Dawn would come in a few hours, and with it, the streets would fill with people. She didn't want them to see her in this state, like just another homeless person. She thought about the little she had left, $3 in her wallet, a few rags in her suitcase, a broken heart in her chest. She forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled from the cold and exhaustion. She had nowhere to go, or so she thought. Then, her mind gave her one last name, Dorothy, her best friend from childhood. She hadn't seen her in years, but she still remembered her address. Dorothy had been like a sister to her in her youth. When they were girls, they played jump rope on the paved street of their old neighborhood. They promised they would never be separated, but life took them down different paths. Eleanor swallowed. Would she still live in the same house? Would she recognize her after all this time? She had no other choice. She took her suitcase with trembling hands and began to walk. The blocks seemed endless. Her wet shoes rubbed against the skin of her feet, causing sores. Every step was torture, but she couldn't stop. Finally, she reached a house with blue siding and a small white picket fence. The lights inside were on. Her heart pounded. She approached the door and raised her hand, but hesitated. What if Dorothy didn't want to see her? What if she turned her away too? She took a breath and knocked gently on the door. A few seconds passed, feeling like an eternity. Then the door opened, and a woman with gray hair tied in a bun appeared on the threshold. Dorothy frowned when she saw her, but as soon as her eyes recognized her, her expression changed completely. "Eleanor!" she exclaimed in surprise. Eleanor tried to smile, but her face only showed exhaustion and sadness. "Hello, Dorothy." "My God, woman, what happened to you? You're soaked. Come in, come in." Dorothy gently took her arm and led her inside. The warmth of the house immediately enveloped her. The living room was cozy, smelling of freshly brewed coffee. There were blankets on the sofas and family photos on the walls. Eleanor felt like she was in another world. Dorothy had her sit on a plush armchair and ran to get her a towel. "Here, dry yourself off a bit." Her voice sounded worried. "Do you want some hot tea?" Eleanor nodded silently. When Dorothy returned with a steaming mug, she looked at her intently. "Now, tell me what happened." Eleanor held the mug with both hands, enjoying the warmth, but didn't drink right away. She didn't know where to begin. "Ethan," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. Dorothy frowned. "What happened with Ethan?" Eleanor looked down. "He kicked me out of my house." Dorothy took a few seconds to react. "What?" "He kicked me out," she repeated, feeling the tears burn her eyes. "He told me it was for the best, that there was no more room for me." The mug in her hands began to tremble. Dorothy looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "That can't be. That boy always adored you." Eleanor put the mug on the table and covered her face with her hands. "That's what I thought, too." Dorothy took a breath, trying to contain her anger. "Where have you been since he kicked you out?" "On the street," she replied in a weak voice. "No one would help me." Dorothy felt a lump in her throat. "Stay here, my friend. You don't have to go anywhere." Eleanor looked up. "I don't want to be a burden." "Don't be silly," Dorothy said, taking her hands. "There will always be a place for you here." Eleanor nodded, her eyes red. She remained silent for a while, feeling the warmth of the house, the smell of the coffee, the weight of exhaustion in her bones. Dorothy watched her tenderly. "Eleanor, do you still have that old chest you had when we were young?" Eleanor blinked. "What chest?" "The one with letters, photos, memories. You always said you'd open it one day to see what life left you." Eleanor felt a chill. "I don't know. I think it's in my suitcase." Dorothy smiled nostalgically. "Maybe it's time to open it." Eleanor looked at her strangely, not understanding why, but deep in her heart, she felt those words hid something more. The silence of Dorothy's house was comforting after spending the night outdoors. For the first time, Eleanor felt the warmth of a home, even if it wasn't hers. The cup of tea in her hands was still warm, but she wasn't drinking it anymore. Her mind was elsewhere. Dorothy had mentioned something that stirred memories buried deep within her, the old chest from her youth. Eleanor hadn't thought about it in years. She remembered storing it in the back of her closet, between old clothes and shoes she no longer wore. She always said she would open it one day, but she never did. Something inside her always made her postpone it. Now, it was in the suitcase she had brought with her. She felt tired, but curiosity took over. She leaned over and opened the suitcase with trembling hands. Among the few changes of clothes, she felt the cold, worn wood of the chest. It was small, heavier than she remembered. Dorothy sat beside her, watching with interest. "Open it, Eleanor." Eleanor ran her fingers over the lid, feeling every crack. It was strange that after so many years, something so insignificant could cause a lump in her throat. "I don't know if I want to," she murmured. Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Eleanor sighed. "Because I feel like what's inside belongs to a life that no longer exists." Dorothy took her hand gently. "Maybe it's time to remember who you were before life took so much from you." Eleanor pressed her lips together. With a slow movement, she lifted the lid. Inside, time had stood still. Yellowed photos, newspaper clippings, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, and letters, many letters. Eleanor blinked in surprise. She didn't remember saving so many. She picked one at random. The paper was wrinkled with age, but the ink was still legible. With a racing heart, she began to read. "My dearest Eleanor, I have never known a woman with a light like yours. Since you came into my life, everything has changed. You have given me hope when I thought there was no reason to go on. You have shown me that kindness still exists. I can never thank you enough, but I hope these words help you know how much you mean to me. With all my love, Robert." Eleanor felt the air catch in her lungs. Robert. The name echoed in her mind like a distant memory. Dorothy noticed her reaction. "Who is Robert?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. Robert. A man who had been important in her past. a man who had marked her life in a way she never wanted to admit. Her fingers trembled as she picked up another letter and opened it. My sweet Eleanor, fate has put us on different paths, but I want you to know that I will always be grateful for everything you did for me. If life ever takes you to a dark place, if you ever feel that the world has turned its back on you, remember that you are not alone. I will always take care of you. With eternal love, Robert. The lump in her throat grew tighter. How could she have forgotten this? How could she have forgotten Robert? Dorothy looked at her cautiously. Eleanor, what do these letters mean? Eleanor swallowed. They're from a man I knew many years ago. Dorothy narrowed her eyes. An important man? Eleanor let out a dry laugh. More than I imagined at the time. She fell silent, holding the letters with both hands. She knew Dorothy was waiting for an answer, but she didn't even know how to explain it herself. Robert had been a man with a destined path, a man who belonged to a world that wasn't hers, a man who, despite everything, had promised he would never forget her. And there were his words, trapped on paper, waiting to be remembered. Eleanor took a deep breath and took the last letter from the chest, the thickest, the heaviest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Dorothy watched her with wide eyes. Inside, besides the letter, there was something else. A document, a sealed envelope. Eleanor felt her heart stop for a second. She looked at Dorothy with a mixture of confusion and fear. What is this? Dorothy shook her head. I don't know, my friend, but I think you're about to find out. Eleanor held the letter in her hands, her breath held. Her fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the sealed envelope. The weight of the document inside was almost unbearable, not because of its size, but because of what it could mean. Dorothy looked at her impatiently, leaning a little forward. Are you going to open it, or do you want me to? She asked with a nervous smile. Eleanor swallowed and shook her head. I'll do it. With trembling hands, she slid her finger along the edge of the envelope and broke the seal. She carefully pulled out the papers, as if touching a piece of her past that had been long forgotten. The first document had the letterhead of a law firm. Her heart pounded as she read the heading. Last Will and Testament of Mr. Robert Montgomery. Eleanor blinked. It can't be. Dorothy moved closer. What does it say? Eleanor began to read aloud, her eyes scanning every word with growing astonishment. I, Robert Montgomery, being of sound mind, declare that in the event of my death, a significant portion of my assets shall be designated to the only person who, without asking for anything in return, gave me her support and affection in the most difficult times of my life, Mrs. Eleanor Miller. Eleanor felt the air get stuck in her throat. Dorothy snatched the document from her hands, reading it quickly. My God, he left you a fortune. Eleanor shook her head, still unable to believe it. It must be a mistake. It's no mistake, my friend, Dorothy said, pointing to the last lines of the document. Here's your name, your address. This was drafted years ago. Eleanor sank into the armchair, feeling the world spin around her. How could this be possible? How had she never known about this? Memories of Robert flooded her mind. He had been a businessman, but also someone who carried a great sadness. When she met him, he was going through a personal crisis, and she, without knowing it, had given him something he never had, someone to trust. She never imagined that after so many years he would still remember her, let alone leave her an inheritance. But why was I never notified? She asked in a low voice. Dorothy checked the papers again. It says here they tried to locate you, but, my God, Eleanor, the letter arrived more than 10 years ago. Eleanor felt a chill. It means you've had money all this time and you didn't know it. Eleanor rested her hands on her knees, breathing deeply. Her whole life she had lived on just enough, counting every penny, making sure not to be a burden to anyone. She had worked until her body could no longer take it, and all that time, she had a fortune waiting for her. I can't believe it, she whispered. Dorothy smiled with excitement. Eleanor, this changes everything. You don't have to depend on anyone anymore. Eleanor looked up. She had depended on Ethan, and he had thrown her out onto the street without a second glance. She had depended on the charity of others, and no one had offered her a hand. Now, Fate had given her a chance. She was no longer the helpless woman she had been a few hours ago. Now she had something no one expected. Power. Dorothy watched her curiously. What are you going to do with all this? Eleanor pressed her lips together, because that was the big question. What would she do with all that money? What would she do now that the game had completely changed? The next 2 days were a blur. With Dorothy's unwavering support, Eleanor met with the law firm that managed Robert's estate. They spent hours reviewing documents, understanding the full extent of her inheritance, not just money, but properties and investments. As the reality of her newfound power settled in, the fragile, heartbroken woman who had shivered on a park bench began to fade. In her place, a quiet, steel-like resolve started to form. It wasn't just about getting her house back. It was about reclaiming her dignity. Dawn began to filter through the windows of Dorothy's house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Eleanor hadn't slept at all. She had remained seated on the sofa, with Robert's documents on her lap, reading them over and over, as if at any moment the letters would disappear and it would all be a dream. But it wasn't. It was still hard for her to accept reality. She had a fortune to her name and had never known. From the moment Ethan kicked her out, her mind had been dominated by sadness and despair. But now, something inside her had changed. She could feel it. She was no longer the same woman who had cried in the rain, begging for a roof over her head. Eleanor had something no one counted on: power. Dorothy entered the living room with 2 cups of coffee. Her hair was tied up, and her expression was a mix of joy and expectation. "Well?" she asked, handing her a cup. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor held the hot cup in her hands, feeling the steam caress her tired face. "I don't know." Dorothy looked at her intently. "You don't know? Woman, you have enough money to live like a queen for the rest of your life." Eleanor sipped some coffee, letting the warmth fill her body. "It's not just about the money." Dorothy crossed her arms. "Then what are you going to do?" Eleanor took a deep breath. She wasn't going to tell anyone about her inheritance. Not yet. Not until she knew exactly what to do with it. "I'm going to find out what's going on with Ethan and Victoria." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "Why do you want to know about those scoundrels?" Eleanor gripped the cup tighter. "Because if I'm going to make a decision, I want to do it right." Dorothy sighed. "All right, but don't be crazy enough to try and help them." Eleanor didn't answer. Not because she wanted to help them, but because she had a feeling. Something didn't add up. If Ethan and Victoria had enough money to kick her out without a care, why were they so desperate to get her out of the house? Something wasn't right, and she was going to find out. Eleanor spent the rest of the day resting and organizing her thoughts. Dorothy convinced her to take a hot bath and put on clean clothes, and when she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized her own reflection. She looked tired, but she also looked stronger. In the afternoon, wearing one of Dorothy's coats, she went for a walk through the city. She knew exactly where to go: the bank where Ethan had his account. When she arrived, she stood for a few minutes observing the entrance. She felt small compared to the imposing glass building, but she didn't let it intimidate her. She took a deep breath and went inside. The receptionist looked at her curiously as she approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" Eleanor gave her a friendly smile. "I'd like to speak with someone about certain financial transactions." The woman nodded and directed her to an advisor. Eleanor sat down across from a man in a dark suit who looked at her professionally. "How can I help you?" Eleanor took out Robert's documents. "I need access to these funds, and I'd also like to inquire about certain debts I'm interested in." The man took the papers, and his expression changed instantly. "Ma'am, you are the heir of Mr. Robert Montgomery?" Eleanor nodded calmly. The man blinked several times, as if he couldn't believe it. "But no one has claimed these funds in years." "I know," Eleanor replied, "and that's why I want to use them now." The advisor reviewed the information, and after a few minutes, he nodded. "You have immediate access to a considerable sum, in addition to properties and—" Eleanor cut him off with a wave of her hand. "I don't want the details now. I want you to find out something else for me." The man frowned. "Tell me." Eleanor clasped her fingers on the table. I want to know if there are any outstanding debts in the name of Ethan Miller and Victoria Adams. The advisor typed on his computer. After a few minutes, his expression hardened. In fact, yes. Eleanor felt a chill. How much do they owe? The man turned the screen slightly toward her. Eleanor read the numbers, and her heart stopped for an instant. It was a fortune in debt. Ethan and Victoria weren't doing well. They were ruined. She leaned back in her seat, feeling everything suddenly make sense. They hadn't kicked her out just because they wanted more space. They hadn't kicked her out because they didn't love her anymore. They had kicked her out because they needed to sell the house to pay their debts. Dorothy was right. It wasn't just cruelty. It was desperation. Eleanor felt a fire ignite within her. They were capable of throwing out the woman who cared for them their whole lives just to save their own skins. But now, she was in control. I want to buy all of those debts, she said firmly. The advisor looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? Eleanor smiled coldly. Absolutely. The man nodded and began to process the paperwork. Meanwhile, Eleanor looked out the bank window. The city continued its course, but for her, everything had changed. The game had changed, and now she held all the pieces. Eleanor left the bank with her heart pounding. Her breathing was deep and controlled, but inside she felt a mix of fury and adrenaline. Ethan and Victoria were ruined, and thinking they were smarter than anyone, they had thrown her onto the street, hoping to sell the house to cover their debts. But now, without knowing it, she owned every cent they owed. She walked with a firm stride, without the fragility of the woman she had been days ago. Now she had a purpose. Not only would she get back what they took from her, but she would make them pay for what they did. The plan began to form in her mind with precision. For her revenge to work, she couldn't reveal her identity yet. If Ethan and Victoria knew she had money, they would find a way to manipulate her, as they always had. No, she would have to become someone else. Someone with power. Someone they would trust without realizing they were walking into their own trap. She had to become an investor interested in the house. She spent the rest of the afternoon planning the details with Dorothy. Woman, this is crazy, her friend said, shaking her head. Do you really want to do this? Eleanor smiled maliciously. Don't you think they deserve it? Dorothy crossed her arms. Of course they do. Those ingrates deserve the worst. But this is dangerous. What if they find out who you are before it's too late? Eleanor looked at herself in the dining room mirror. Her reflection showed an older woman with her gray hair up and expression lines that told a story of sacrifice. But behind those tired eyes was a strength even she didn't know she had. They won't, she affirmed confidently. I'll make sure of it. Dorothy sighed. So, what's the plan? Eleanor smiled. I'm going to become a businesswoman. The next morning, Dorothy helped her find the right outfit, an elegant black coat, low-heeled shoes, and a discreet but good-quality handbag. She didn't have to look like a flashy millionaire, just a businesswoman with enough resources to make a significant purchase. To complete the disguise, she put her hair in a bun and wore a pair of thin reading glasses. Dorothy looked her up and down and smiled. You look like a wealthy lady who has no time for nonsense. Eleanor lifted her chin with a smile. Perfect. Before making her move, she needed an excuse to contact Victoria. She knew her daughter-in-law was cunning and suspicious, but also desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. She picked up her cell phone, and with the firm, calm voice she had practiced with Dorothy, dialed Victoria's number. Hello? Her daughter-in-law's impatient voice answered. Eleanor smiled slightly. Good morning, Mrs. Adams. My name is Helen Roberts. I'm a real estate investor, and I've received information that your property might be available for sale. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Victoria cleared her throat. Who gave you that information? Eleanor allowed herself a small laugh. Let's just say I have contacts in the financial sector. I know you're looking for a buyer, and I could be the solution to your problem. Victoria took a deep breath. Are you interested in the house? That depends. I'd like to see it in person. Victoria didn't hesitate. Of course. When could you come by? Today. Victoria hesitated for a second. Okay, I'll text you the address. Eleanor smiled with satisfaction. Perfect. I'll see you in a few hours. She hung up the phone and looked at Dorothy with pride. It worked. Dorothy clapped softly. You're more dangerous than I thought. Eleanor took her purse. Now, let's see how quickly she falls into the trap. When she arrived at the house that had been her home, a shiver ran down her spine. But she didn't let her emotions show on her face. Victoria was waiting at the door with a forced smile. Mrs. Roberts, welcome. Eleanor shook her hand firmly. A pleasure. She entered the house, and her eyes scanned every corner. Nothing had changed. Everything was still in its place. Even the family photosed the photos where she no longer appeared. She pressed her lips together but didn't let anger cloud her judgment. Victoria guided her through the house, talking about the great benefits of the property. Eleanor feigned interest. You can tell it's been well maintained, she commented in a neutral tone. Victoria laughed with false modesty. Oh yes, my husband and I have worked hard to keep it in good condition. Eleanor felt a lump in her stomach. Liar. But she smiled kindly. That's admirable. After touring the house, Victoria led her to the dining room. So, are you interested? Eleanor pretended to hesitate. It could be a good investment, but what's the price? Victoria named a ridiculously high figure. Eleanor tapped her fingers on the table. I'll think about it. Victoria tried to hide her disappointment. Of course. Eleanor stood up and shook her hand again. I'll let you know my decision soon. Victoria nodded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor walked out of the house with elegant steps without looking back. She didn't need to think about anything. She had already made her decision. And that same afternoon, at the bank, she formally purchased the property, without Ethan and Victoria knowing. The house now belonged to her. The game was about to change. Ethan came home that afternoon, feeling more exhausted than usual. For weeks, he had a weight on his chest that he couldn't shake. Something inside him told him his life was about to fall apart, but he didn't know exactly why. There were problems. Too many. The debts were suffocating them. Victoria insisted that everything would be fine, that they would soon find a solution, but Ethan knew it was a lie. The bank was pressuring them, the bills were piling up, the tech startup he had invested all his savings in was about to go bankrupt. And to make matters worse, ever since they got rid of Eleanor, Victoria had been acting stranger than usual. When he entered the house, his wife was sitting in the living room, looking at something on her phone with a serious expression. Victoria, Ethan said, closing the door behind him. She looked up, forcing a smile. Hi, honey. Ethan put his briefcase on the table and looked at her intently. Why didn't you tell me someone was interested in the house? Victoria's smile vanished for a second. Who told you that? A neighbor mentioned he saw a well-dressed woman coming in today. He said she looked like a businesswoman. Victoria settled into the armchair with a nonchalant air. Oh yes, she was a real estate investor. She contacted me because she heard we might be selling. Ethan felt a chill. And why didn't you tell me? Victoria sighed and rolled her eyes. Because it wasn't certain. She just came to see the house. It made no sense to alarm you if she didn't end up buying. Ethan frowned. Something about his wife's attitude didn't sit right with him. And what did she say? That she'll think about it. And how much did you ask for? Victoria smiled smugly. A good price. Ethan looked at her suspiciously. Victoria, if this woman is really interested, we should discuss it together. It's our house. Victoria stood up and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Don't worry so much, honey. I know what I'm doing. But Ethan wasn't so sure anymore. Something didn't add up. That night, while Victoria slept, Ethan stayed in the living room with his laptop. He logged into his bank account and checked the recent transactions. There was nothing out of the ordinary until he saw a suspicious transfer. Someone had deposited a large sum of money into Victoria's account. The deposit had been made from a business account, but with no specific details. A cold sweat ran down Ethan's back. Where did this come from? He looked at the date and realized the money had arrived the same day the supposed investor visited the house. He slammed the laptop shut. He didn't trust Victoria. He never had completely, but now he had more reason than ever to doubt her. He stood up slowly, feeling the tension in his muscles. If she was receiving money, what else was she hiding from him? He went up the stairs carefully and entered the bedroom. Victoria was fast asleep. Ethan looked at her for a long time. He had to find out the truth. He couldn't just stand by. The next day, he would start investigating. Victoria woke up early that morning, feeling more anxious than usual. As soon as Ethan left for work, she grabbed her phone and checked her bank account. There it was, the investor's deposit. She smiled with satisfaction. The money wasn't enough to cover all their debts yet, but it was a good start. If she could convince that woman to buy the house at the price she asked, she could get out of there forever. She was tired of this life. Ethan was a failure. Ever since his business started to crumble, he had become a gray, depressing man. All day he complained about the bills, the money, the house. Before, he at least pretended to be strong, but now he was nothing more than a burden. Victoria wasn't willing to sync with him. She had a better plan. She got out of bed and dialed a number on her phone. "Hello, my love." Yes, the first payment came through. A seductive laugh escaped her lips. "Everything is going as planned." On the other end of the line, a man's voice replied in a pleased tone. "And your husband? Does he suspect anything?" Victoria rolled her eyes. "Please, Ethan is an idiot. He thinks I'm doing all this for our good." "Perfect," the man replied. "As soon as you sell the house, we'll leave together." Victoria bit her lower lip with excitement. "I can't wait." While Victoria thought she had everything under control, Ethan was in his office, sitting in front of his computer with a tense jaw. He had spent all night thinking about the money Victoria had received in her account. Nothing made sense. Who was paying her? Why hadn't she told him anything? That morning, on his way out of the house, he decided to check something else. An old friend of his worked at the bank, and with a little persuasion, he managed to get him some information about his wife's account. When he saw the recent transactions, his stomach churned. There was a series of deposits from a second account in a man's name, a man he didn't know. Ethan felt a knot in his chest. Victoria wasn't just hiding money. There was another man in her life. He closed his eyes and rested his elbows on the desk, clenching his fists. He always knew his wife was ambitious. He always knew she didn't love him as much as she said, but he never thought she would be so brazen. She was cheating on him, and he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. Eleanor, on the other hand, knew exactly what she was doing. After Victoria had taken the bait, all that was left was to wait for the next step. She was sitting in an elegant cafe, reviewing the papers for the house that now belonged to her. She smiled to herself. In a matter of days, Ethan and Victoria would receive a notification that they were no longer the owners of anything. But before that happened, she wanted to see how far Victoria would go in her desperation. As if fate were on her side, her phone rang. "Mrs. Roberts," Victoria said in a syrupy voice. "Did you have time to consider my offer?" Eleanor smiled, hiding her satisfaction. "In fact, I have," she replied in a calm tone. "I think we can reach an agreement." On the other end of the line, Victoria almost let out a sigh of relief. "That's wonderful. Can we meet today?" "Of course," Eleanor said. "I'll stop by your house this afternoon." "I'll be waiting," Victoria answered, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. Eleanor hung up the phone and took a sip of her coffee. Victoria thought she was winning, but in reality, she had already lost everything. That afternoon, Victoria made sure to look impeccable. She applied her makeup more carefully than usual, wore her favorite silk blouse, and put on expensive perfume. She had to look trustworthy, successful. When she heard the doorbell, she took a deep breath and walked to the door with a practiced smile on her face. When she opened it, she found the investor standing there in her impeccable black coat and elegant glasses. "Mrs. Roberts, so good to see you." Eleanor shook her hand elegantly. "Likewise, Mrs. Adams." Victoria invited her in and led her straight to the dining room. She had some documents organized on the table. "I want you to know that this house has great sentimental value for us," Victoria said with feigned nostalgia. "But circumstances force us to sell." Eleanor nodded with false understanding. "I understand perfectly." Victoria slid the papers across the table. I have the documents ready here. If you agree to the price, we can close the deal today. Eleanor took the papers and reviewed them calmly. The price is high, but I think we can make it work. Victoria couldn't contain her excitement. That would be incredible. Eleanor watched her in silence for a few seconds. Victoria really thought she was about to win. Poor thing. She took a deep breath and stood up. I'm going to consult with my team, and I'll give you a final answer tomorrow. Victoria stood up too and shook her hand firmly. I'm sure it will be an excellent deal for both of us. Eleanor smiled kindly. No doubt. She left the house without looking back, her heart pounding. In less than 24 hours, Victoria would receive the news that she no longer had anything, and there would be no escape. But what Eleanor didn't know was that the bomb of betrayal was about to explode. Because Ethan already had proof of his wife's infidelity, and when he discovered that Victoria was planning to leave him with nothing, the real chaos would begin. The afternoon sky was beginning to turn shades of orange as Victoria fixed herself in front of her bedroom mirror. She felt victorious. The supposed investor was practically convinced to buy the house, and as soon as the deal was closed, she would be gone forever. Ethan suspected nothing, or at least, that's what she thought. She went downstairs with a satisfied smile and checked her phone. Her lover had sent her a message. Honey, it's almost time. Make sure you get the money, and I'll see you at the airport. Victoria felt a thrill of excitement. Finally, she would leave this miserable life behind. But what she didn't know was that Ethan already knew everything. Hours earlier, Ethan had made a decision. After discovering the suspicious deposits in Victoria's account, he did what any betrayed man would do. He followed her. He saw her enter a fancy cafe and sit down with a tall, well-dressed man. It didn't take him long to recognize him, her lover. He stayed in his car, watching with a churning stomach as Victoria laughed with the man, holding his hand across the table as if he were her husband. Rage built up in his chest. He took out his phone and started taking pictures. If Victoria thought she could cheat on him and leave him in ruins, she was sorely mistaken. When Victoria came down to the living room that afternoon, she found Ethan sitting on the sofa with a cold, calculating expression. Where were you? He asked in a tense voice. Victoria, without losing her composure, smiled at him. I just went out to do some shopping. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Shopping? Or were you with your lover? Victoria's face went pale. What are you talking about? Ethan took out his phone and showed her the photos. Victoria felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. That's not what it looks like. Ethan stood up abruptly. Stop lying! I have proof of everything. Victoria gritted her teeth, but before she could answer, the doorbell rang. She froze. She knew exactly who was at the door. Ethan looked at her suspiciously. Are you expecting someone? Victoria tried to stay calm. It must be the investor. Ethan frowned. What investor? But Victoria couldn't answer. The doorbell rang again, and Ethan, without waiting for an explanation, went to open the door. When he saw the woman standing in front of him, he felt something in his head explode. Mom? Eleanor looked at him coldly, with her elegant black coat and her glasses on. Hello, Ethan. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. It can't be. Eleanor walked in slowly, with a smile on her lips. Were you expecting someone else? Ethan looked at Victoria in disbelief. You knew it was her? Victoria shook her head quickly. I had no idea. She tricked me. Eleanor let out a slight laugh. Don't get it twisted, Victoria. You were the one who tried to trick me. Ethan felt his chest tighten. What's going on here? Eleanor took some documents from her purse and placed them on the table. What's going on, son? Is that this house no longer belongs to you? Victoria's eyes widened in horror. No, that's impossible. Eleanor crossed her arms. I bought all your debts. I bought the mortgage. I bought every cent you owed the bank. She leaned over the table, looking at Victoria intensely. So now, all of this belongs to me. Ethan felt the world collapsing around him. Victoria grabbed the papers with trembling hands. This can't be true. This is fraud. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Fraud? You mean like trying to sell a house you don't own? We can't lose everything, Victoria exclaimed, her voice breaking. "Ethan, say something!" But Ethan was in shock. Not only had his wife betrayed him, not only had he discovered she planned to run away with another man, but now his mother, the woman he had kicked out as if she were trash, was back to claim what was hers. Eleanor adjusted her glasses elegantly. "So, I ask you now, who's going to lose everything?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Victoria clung to the table in desperation while Ethan felt the floor crumbling beneath his feet. Everything they had done, everything was about to backfire on them. What will Ethan do now that he's lost everything? Will Victoria accept defeat or try to get revenge? If you want to find out what happens after this shocking revelation, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and comment where you're watching from. The story isn't over yet, and what's coming will bring more unexpected twists, tension, and justice. Don't miss it. The silence inside the house was thick, suffocating. Ethan's head felt like it was about to explode as he tried to process everything that had just happened. His mother, the same one he had thrown out without remorse, was now the owner of his house. But that wasn't the worst part. The woman with whom he had shared his life, with whom he had made future plans, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Victoria looked at him in panic, like a cornered animal. Her world was collapsing at the same speed as his. "This has to be a joke," she yelled, her voice sharp with desperation. Eleanor, who until that moment had remained unperturbed, calmly placed the papers on the table. "It's not a joke," she said coldly. "It's reality." Victoria gritted her teeth and looked at Ethan with rage. "Say something! You can't let this old hag take everything from us!" Ethan didn't answer. He was still staring at the documents. Every number, every clause, it was all there. There was no escape. He felt short of breath. The last few months had been a storm of problems. First the debts, then the pressure from the bank, and now he discovered that his wife had not only cheated on him with another man, but had tried to leave him with nothing. Eleanor watched him in silence. She saw how her son, the same one who had turned his back on her, was now breaking down in front of her. Part of her felt pity. But another part remembered the cold of the night she was left homeless. She remembered the door slamming in her face. She remembered her son's voice saying, "It's better this way, Mom." Victoria screamed again, "I'm not leaving this house." Eleanor looked at her with superiority. "It's not your decision." Victoria ran to Ethan and grabbed his arm. "Do something, you idiot." But Ethan was still paralyzed. Eleanor took a paper and slid it slowly across the table. "Here is the official notice. You have 48 hours to leave." Victoria snatched the document from her hands and tore it to pieces. "I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor sighed patiently. "If you don't leave on your own, you'll leave with the police." Victoria clenched her fists. "Ethan, say something." For the first time, Ethan looked at her with more than just confusion. There was anger in his eyes, pain, and a hatred he had never felt for her before. "How long have you been cheating on me?" His voice was quieter than he expected, but every word was loaded with venom. Victoria tensed. "What?" "How long have you had another man?" Ethan yelled, slamming his fist on the table. Victoria fell silent. "Come on, answer me," he roared. But she didn't need to speak. Victoria's silence was her confession. Ethan felt a stab in his stomach. It had all been a lie, all the promises, the plans, the years together. Victoria had never loved him. Eleanor watched them calmly, as if the scene in front of her was no surprise. Ethan ran a hand over his face. He felt defeated. "Mom." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Yes? I have nowhere to go." Eleanor tilted her head. "And what do you expect me to do?" Ethan swallowed. "I need help." "Oh, really?" Eleanor crossed her arms. "Like the help you gave me when you threw me out on the street?" The color drained from Ethan's face. "Mom, Eleanor interrupted him with a firm voice. "You have no right to ask for anything." Victoria scoffed. "Enough of the drama. Ethan, go talk to the bank and fix this." Ethan looked at her again. "Do you have any idea what you've just done to me?" Victoria rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, it's not that serious." "Not serious?" Ethan laughed humorlessly. "You were robbing me. You planned to leave me with nothing and run off with your lover?" Victoria opened her mouth to reply, but Ethan held up a hand. "You know what?" he hissed. "I don't care if the house belongs to my mother. I'm leaving." Victoria frowned. "You can't leave me alone with her. You left me alone a long time ago." Ethan grabbed his jacket and walked out of the house without looking back. But fate wasn't done with him yet. That same afternoon, Ethan arrived at his office, feeling like a walking dead man. The last few days had been a nightmare, and all he wanted was to focus on his work to forget the catastrophe of his personal life. But as soon as he walked through the door, he felt something was wrong. The whispers, the stares from his colleagues, and then his boss's dry voice. "Miller, in my office." Ethan swallowed and followed him. When the door closed, his boss leaned against the desk with a serious expression. "I'd like to say this surprises me, but it doesn't." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" The man slid a folder across the desk. Ethan opened it with trembling hands and felt the floor crumble beneath his feet. It was a detailed report of his financial problems, his debts, Victoria's fraud attempts, and worst of all, his name was implicated in suspicious transactions he didn't even know about. "We can't afford to have someone with these kinds of problems in the company, Miller." Ethan felt a cold sweat. I didn't do anything illegal." "Maybe not directly, but your wife did," his boss sighed. "And the bad publicity affects all of us." Ethan fell silent. He already knew what was coming. "You're fired," his boss said in a definitive tone. Ethan closed his eyes. First, he had lost his house, then he had lost his wife, and now he had just lost his job. When he walked out of the office with his box of belongings in his hands, he felt that his life had been completely destroyed. He had no money, no house, no family. He had nothing. And worst of all, he had caused it all himself. Victoria felt her world falling apart. She had spent the last 2 hours pacing back and forth in the living room, phone in hand, dialing Ethan's number over and over, but he didn't answer. The idiot had left her alone. She still couldn't believe everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. Just yesterday, she had it all planned out in her head. She could already see herself living far away with her lover, enjoying the fortune she would get from the house. But now, she had nothing. She put her hands on the table and took a deep breath. She had to think. She had to act before it was too late. She straightened up, grabbed her purse, and rushed upstairs. In her room, she opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. She started throwing in all the clothes she could, then went to the bathroom and packed her makeup, perfumes, and jewelry. She needed to get out of there as soon as possible. She took her phone and typed a hurried message. "We have to leave now. Get ready. I'm going to the bank for the money." She sent it to her lover, and without waiting for a reply, went downstairs with the suitcase in hand. But when she got to the door, Eleanor was there. The old woman was watching her with her arms crossed, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Where do you think you're going?" Victoria felt a chill, but quickly regained her composure. "None of your business," she spat with venom in her voice. "This house is still mine for 48 hours. Eleanor tilted her head with a mocking smile. "That's true. But tell me, Victoria, how do you plan to pay for a plane ticket without any money?" Victoria felt a pang of alarm. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor calmly took out her phone and slid the screen towards her. "I froze all your accounts." Victoria's heart stopped for a second. That can't be." She took out her own phone and quickly opened her banking app. Her hands trembled as the page loaded. When she saw the balance in her account, her blood ran cold. $0. A gasp escaped her lips. No, it can't be. She tried to access another account, but they were all blocked. She stood paralyzed. How did you do this?" Eleanor put her phone in her purse and gave her a triumphant smile. "Don't underestimate a woman who has lived longer than you." Victoria felt her stomach churn with rage and fear. "This is illegal. You can't do this to me." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You tried to sell me a house that wasn't yours anymore. If we're talking about illegality, dear, I think you're in more trouble than I am." Victoria breathed heavily. This couldn't be happening. "Give me my money, you witch." Eleanor laughed. "You don't have any money anymore." Victoria felt her vision blur with anger. "Ethan!" she screamed desperately, even though she knew he wasn't there. Eleanor sighed. Ethan has enough problems of his own. Victoria clenched her fists. This couldn't end like this. She wasn't going to let that old woman destroy her. She lifted her chin defiantly. "Maybe you took my money, but I still have something left." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Oh, really?" Victoria smiled maliciously. "Yes, and I assure you, you won't like it." With that, she took her phone and dashed out the door. Eleanor didn't stop her. She just watched her go, knowing that her last move was about to be played. The question was, how far would Victoria go in her desperation? Ethan walked aimlessly through the city streets, wearing the same wrinkled suit he'd had on since morning. His shirt was dirty, his tie crooked, and his face reflected the exhaustion of a man who had lost everything. The weight of the last few days crushed him with every step. First, his mother had returned, not as the frail, submissive woman he had callously kicked out, but as an unstoppable force who had taken control of everything. Then, he had discovered that Victoria, the woman to whom he had dedicated years of his life, had been cheating on him and planned to leave him with nothing. And as if all that weren't enough, he had lost his job. Without money, without a home, without a family, he was now the one with nowhere to go. When he arrived at his house, the place that had been his for so long, he felt a knot in his stomach. He stood in front of the door, staring at the facade with a strange feeling. It no longer belonged to him. He took a deep breath and went inside. The sound of his own footsteps echoed in the empty interior. The living room was dark. Victoria was supposed to be there, but the silence told him that she too had abandoned him. He walked to the dining room and slumped into a chair, feeling the weight of his life crash down on his shoulders. Then he saw the envelope on the table. His name was written in a hurried hand. With a racing heart, he opened it and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Ethan, I'm not sticking around to watch everything fall apart. You have no money, and I'm not going to waste my life with you. I'm leaving. Don't try to find me. Victoria." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling an uncontainable rage. It had all been a lie. He slammed his fist on the table, letting out a growl of anger and desperation. How had it come to this? He didn't have much time to lament. The next morning, the official notice arrived. Eleanor was evicting him. He was supposed to have 48 hours, but the letter specified that due to his financial status and Victoria's fraud attempts, he had to leave immediately. He looked at the two police officers waiting at the door with neutral expressions. They weren't there to argue, they were just doing their job. Ethan raised his hands in surrender. "There's no need for trouble, I'll leave." One of the officers nodded. "You can take whatever is your property, but the house now belongs to Mrs. Miller." The words hit him like a slap. The house was now his mother's. He took a deep breath and went up to his room. He took a suitcase and began to pack the little he had left. Every object he touched reminded him that, because of him, his mother had gone through the same thing. When he came down with his luggage, the officers stepped aside. Ethan looked at the house one last time before leaving. When the door closed behind him, he felt that his life was also closing. He was completely alone. Not knowing what to do, he began to walk. The same path his mother had taken the night he kicked her out, the same path that he, with his pride and selfishness, had ignored. And now, he was the one with nowhere to go. Victoria was furious. After years of living in comfort, surrounded by luxury, and being the mistress of her own home, she had ended up on the street like a nobody. She had no money, no plan, and worst of all, Eleanor had beaten her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the old woman's triumphant smile, those documents in her hand, taking everything from her. She couldn't accept it. She wouldn't accept defeat. She sat in a seedy cafe, phone in hand, trying to think. She needed to find a way to get revenge, and then it hit her. If Eleanor had gotten everything with her reputation intact, then it was time to destroy it publicly. Victoria spent the next few hours contacting journalists, writing emails, and crafting a convincing story. It didn't take long to find someone willing to listen. A reporter from a tabloid news website responded immediately. "Mrs. Adams, your story sounds very interesting. We'd love to interview you to get the truth behind the scandal." Victoria smiled. She knew the public loved a story of betrayal and abuse, so she prepared her best performance. The next day, the interview was published. Exclusive: elderly woman scams her own son and steals his house, the heartbreaking story of Ethan Miller. Victoria appeared on camera with a devastated expression, faking tears. "Eleanor Miller deceived us all," she declared with a trembling voice. "She made Ethan trust her, only to betray him and take everything we had." The reporters nodded with serious expressions. "Are you saying your own mother-in-law planned to take your home?" Victoria nodded dramatically. "That's right. Ethan took care of her for years, but she, full of greed, took advantage of an oversight to manipulate documents and take our house." The story, though completely false, went viral within hours. The comments section filled with outrage. "What a cruel woman! How could she do this to her own son? Poor victims! What an injustice!" Victoria gloated with every reaction. Everything was going perfectly. But then, something she didn't expect happened. Eleanor was at home when Dorothy walked in with her phone in hand, her face red with fury. "Have you seen this?" Eleanor took the phone and saw the headlines. She sighed patiently. "I knew she would try something like this." Dorothy looked at her, incredulous. "And it doesn't bother you?" Eleanor smiled calmly. "Bother me? Number. But it does tire me." Dorothy slumped onto the sofa. "Victoria is a snake. How are you going to fix this?" Eleanor picked up her own phone and dialed a number. "Oh dear, I already fixed this a while ago." Hours later, a new article appeared in the press. The truth behind Victoria Adams, the woman who tried to rob her own mother-in-law. The same website Victoria had used to defame Eleanor now betrayed her. The proof of her fraud, her infidelity to Ethan, the legal documents showing she had tried to sell a house that no longer belonged to Harriet was all there. Victoria, who had been celebrating her victory, felt her blood run cold when she saw the new headlines. Victoria Adams, exposed in fraud and betrayal scandal. The woman who lied to manipulate the press. Exclusive: Ethan Miller breaks his silence and reveals the truth about his ex-wife. Victoria opened a video in which Ethan, with a visibly tired face, gave a statement. "My mother never betrayed us. We betrayed her." The internet exploded. The comments that had previously defended her now attacked her. "Victoria is a liar. What a disgusting person. I can't believe I tried to defend this woman. She deserves everything she gets." Victoria felt her whole body tremble. Her final blow had been the one that finished destroying her. Ethan walked through the city streets with slumped shoulders and a hardened face. The public humiliation, Victoria's betrayal, and the loss of everything he had built still weighed heavily on him. He had spent the last few days wandering between cheap motels and the homes of acquaintances who were slowly starting to turn their backs on him. His money was running out, his reputation was ruined. He had no job, no home, no friends, and yet he felt he deserved every second of his suffering. He had lost everything because of his own arrogance and selfishness. But what he didn't expect was to receive that message. Victoria had texted him. "Ethan, we need to talk. It's urgent. Come to the address I'm sending you. I promise it's important." For several minutes, he stared at the screen, hesitating whether to reply. He knew Victoria couldn't be trusted. He knew she only looked out for herself. But there was something in that message that sparked a restless curiosity. He sighed and put the phone in his pocket. If it was a trick, it wouldn't surprise him. But if Victoria was as desperate as he was, maybe it was worth seeing how far she had fallen. It was almost 9 p.m. when Ethan arrived at the location Victoria had sent. It was an old motel on the outskirts of the city, a rundown place with a flickering neon sign and moisture-stained walls. When he knocked on the door of room 12, Victoria took several seconds to open it. And when she did, Ethan almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was a mess, her face had deep, dark circles under her eyes, and her once impeccable clothes were now wrinkled and stained. The arrogant, haughty woman she once was had disappeared. Victoria stepped aside to let him in. "Thanks for coming," she said in a raspy voice, closing the door behind him. Ethan crossed his arms and looked at her coldly. I don't have much time. What do you want? Victoria bit her lip, avoiding his gaze. Ethan, this all got out of control. He let out a bitter laugh. Is that what you have to say? Victoria looked up and took a step toward him. Listen to me. We can still fix this. Fix it? He repeated, incredulous. What is there to fix, Victoria? That you cheated on me? That you tried to rob me? That you destroyed our lives for your own greed? Victoria blinked, as if she were genuinely surprised by his reaction. I just wanted a better life. And in the process, you ruined me. You ruined us. Victoria took a deep breath and took his hand, squeezing it desperately. But we can start over, Ethan. We can leave this city and forget everything. Ethan felt a chill. Was she serious? Did Victoria really believe he would leave everything behind to run away with her? I have some money hidden, she whispered, a feverish glint in her eyes. It's not much, but we can use it to start over somewhere else. And what about everything you did? Ethan asked in a harsh voice. Do you just expect me to forget it? Victoria held his gaze. If we leave, none of that will matter. Ethan shook his head, pulling his hand away from hers. Number. Victoria tensed. What? No, he repeated, taking a step back. I'm not going with you. Victoria frowned. Don't be stupid, Ethan. You have nothing. No one else is going to help you. Ethan looked at her coldly. I'd rather have nothing than ever trust you again. Victoria breathed heavily, her face transforming from pleading to fury in seconds. You're an idiot. Ethan walked toward the door, ignoring her tantrum. But before he could leave, Victoria said something that made him stop. If you won't help me, then I'll make sure you sink completely too. He turned around slowly. Victoria was looking at him with a twisted smile, her eyes burning with resentment. What do you mean by that? Victoria shrugged. Let's just say I still have one last ace up my sleeve. Ethan felt a cold dread. He knew Victoria wouldn't give up without a fight. And if there was one thing he had learned through all this, it was that his ex-wife was capable of anything. Victoria wasn't going to accept defeat, not after everything she had done to secure a comfortable future, not after manipulating, lying, and playing all her cards. She couldn't lose everything without fighting to the end. If Ethan didn't want to leave with her, then let him sink alone. She still had one last plan. Her ex-husband might have been an idiot in many ways, but there was still a way to profit from him, his old company. She knew that even though Ethan had been fired, he still had access to certain accounts. She also knew that the company had handled considerable funds in private projects and that many of those transactions were not fully regulated. In other words, there was money that no one was closely supervising. And if she played her cards right, she could disappear with a sum large enough to start over in another country. Victoria spent the next few days planning her heist from her small motel room. She made several calls, sent emails from fake accounts, and gathered information about Ethan's access to the company. She knew her ex-husband was completely defeated. He had nowhere to live, no money, and was barely surviving on the few contacts he had left. And most importantly, she knew he still had his access credentials. If she could get into the company's systems, she could move a large sum of money to an external account without anyone noticing until it was too late. For that, she just needed an opportunity. And that opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, Ethan received an unexpected call. Ethan Miller? A male voice asked. Yes, who's this? I'm Javier Mendez, from the finance department of your old company. Ethan frowned. Finance? I don't understand. We know you no longer work here, but we need your help with something. There was an error in the records, and it seems your access account is still active. We need you to come to the office to verify some data before we permanently close your profile. Ethan felt a pang of suspicion. Can't you do it without me? We prefer you do it in person to ensure everything is in order. Ethan hesitated. He had no interest in going back to the company, but something told him there was more behind that call. Still, he agreed. What he didn't know was that the call had been orchestrated by Victoria. Victoria was in her motel room, smiling with satisfaction. She had gotten one of her contacts in the company to make the fake call to Ethan. All she had to do now was wait for him to log into the system with his credentials. As soon as he did, she would enter from a remote location and transfer the money. It was perfect. She made sure to have her laptop ready with remote access software configured. The moment Ethan typed his password, she would take control. Victoria smiled maliciously. It would be her final strike. But what Victoria didn't know was that she wasn't the one who had planned a trap. Because Eleanor was already one step ahead. That same day at the company's headquarters, Ethan arrived at the office and was greeted by Javier Mendez. "Thanks for coming, Ethan," the man said, patting him on the back. "We just need you to log into your profile to confirm some data." Ethan nodded and sat in front of the computer. He typed his username and then slowly wrote his password. But at the last second, he stopped. A strange feeling washed over him. Why did they need him to do this? Why so much interest in him logging into his account? And then he understood. Victoria. It could only be her. This was a trap. He leaned over the keyboard and pretended to type his password, but instead of pressing enter, he looked up at Javier. "Who asked you to call me?" Javier frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Come on, Javier. I'm not stupid." Javier swallowed. "Victoria." Ethan closed his eyes in frustration. He knew it. Victoria was trying to steal from the company and use him as a scapegoat. But what neither he nor Javier knew was that Eleanor had already discovered their plan. At that very moment, in a different part of the city, Victoria was in her motel room with her laptop open, waiting for Ethan to log in. But the moment she tried to activate the remote access, her screen froze. She blinked, confused. She tried again. Nothing. And suddenly, a message appeared on her screen. "Victoria Adams has been detected illegally attempting to access a corporate account. All your activities have been recorded. Fraud is a serious crime. The authorities have been notified." Victoria's stomach dropped. Number. She tried to close the window, disconnect the Wi-Fi, but it was too late. Someone had discovered her. And then her phone rang. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was an unknown number. She hesitated but answered. "Hello?" On the other end, Eleanor's voice sounded calm, but with a firmness that chilled her to the bone. "Did you think you were going to get away with it again, Victoria?" Victoria gasped. "You?" "I'm not an easy woman to fool, dear," Eleanor continued, "especially not by someone as desperate as you." Victoria gritted her teeth. "You can't do this to me." Eleanor laughed softly. "I'm not the one doing it to you, Victoria. You did it to yourself." Before Victoria could respond, someone knocked on the motel door. "Police, open the door." Victoria froze. Number. The door burst open, and several officers entered. "Victoria Adams, you are under arrest for attempted fraud and illegal access to corporate systems." Victoria screamed and struggled, but it was no use. The handcuffs closed around her wrists, and as they led her out of the room, still with the phone in her hand, she heard Eleanor's voice one last time. "It seems there's no escape for you this time." Victoria felt the entire world collapse. She had lost. She had tried her last shot, and it was the one that finally destroyed her. The rain fell hard on the city, soaking the streets in a gray, nostalgic veil. Ethan walked aimlessly, his wet coat stuck to his body, his gaze empty. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground were trying to drag him down. He had nothing. No house, no money, no job, no family. Victoria was in jail, exactly where she deserved to be. But that brought him no comfort. Deep down, he didn't even feel satisfaction at her downfall. After all, he had chosen that woman himself. He had been blind. He had destroyed everything he had for a lie. He had spent the last few nights sleeping in cheap motels, spending what little he had left on rundown rooms where the television barely worked and the dampness permeated the walls. His money was running out. The few acquaintances he had turned to no longer answered his calls. The doors that were once open to him were now slammed in his face, and in the silence of those lonely nights, his mind tormented him. He remembered the rain, that night he shut the door in his mother's face. He remembered her pleading voice, "Please, son, open the door." He remembered his own cold voice, void of emotion. "It's better this way." He brought a hand to his face, feeling regret suffocate him. He had made the worst mistake of his life. And now, as everything crumbled around him, there was only one person in the world he could turn to: his mother. When he arrived at Eleanor's house, his former house, he felt his heart beat so hard it threatened to break through his chest. He stood in front of the door for several minutes, feeling the weight of fate on his shoulders. He knew he could turn around and leave. He knew that if he knocked on that door, it might be too late, but he had no other option. His hands trembled as he finally raised his fist and knocked gently. The sound of footsteps on the other side made his heart leap. The door opened, and there she was, Eleanor. She looked at him with an unreadable expression. There was no anger, no satisfaction, but no warmth either. Just a calm gaze, as if she already knew he would come. Ethan swallowed. "Mom." The word felt strange in his mouth. I have nowhere to go." Eleanor said nothing. Ethan lowered his gaze, feeling shame burn his skin. "I lost my house. I lost my job. I lost everything." His voice broke. "And I know it's my fault." Eleanor continued to watch him in silence. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Ethan continued, his voice trembling. "Not after what I did to you." He took a deep breath and looked up. "But I'm still asking for it." Eleanor's eyes shone with an emotion Ethan couldn't identify. For a moment, he thought she would respond, that she would tell him everything was okay, that she would say she was his mother and would always welcome him back. But then, Eleanor took a step back and closed the door. Ethan stood there, in the rain, with a lump in his throat and his chest about to explode. Maybe it was too late. The door closed gently. Ethan stood on the doorstep of the house that was once his, feeling the rain soak his clothes, clinging to his skin like a silent punishment. His mother hadn't insulted him, hadn't yelled at him, hadn't humiliated him. She had simply left him there in the cold, with the weight of his own mistakes. It was worse than any lecture. He took a deep breath and ran a hand over his wet face. He didn't know if they were tears or the rain. Maybe both. He looked at the door for a long time, waiting. But nothing happened. Eleanor didn't open it, didn't come out to find him, didn't tell him everything was okay, and Ethan understood what it truly meant to be alone. Maybe it was too late. He spent the night in a homeless shelter. He couldn't sleep. Around him, other people tried to find rest on thin mats and threadbare blankets. Some mumbled in their sleep, others cried silently. Ethan had never imagined himself in a place like this, but there he was, homeless, penniless, friendless, and all because he had made the wrong choices. He spent hours thinking about his life, about the times he had chosen selfishness over love, how he had put his ambition before the woman who raised him with sacrifices, how he had allowed Victoria to poison him with her greed. And now, after losing everything, how was he going to prove to his mother that he had changed? The next day, he decided he couldn't go on like this. If he wanted a chance at redemption, he had to do something on his own. He left the shelter aimlessly, with empty pockets and a stomach rumbling with hunger. He passed by a farmer's market and saw a group of workers unloading boxes of vegetables. He approached a man who seemed to be in charge. "Need any help?" The man looked him up and down. "You got experience?" "No, but I learned fast." The man snorted and tossed him a box. "Carry this to the stall." Ethan caught the box and carried it where he was told. It wasn't hard, but his body wasn't used to physical labor. After an hour, sweat mixed with the light rain that fell on the city, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The market manager paid him a little at the end of the day, enough to buy bread and a hot coffee. It wasn't much, but it was the first clean money he had earned on his own, and that meant something. Eleanor was in her living room when Dorothy came in with an uncomfortable expression. "I just saw Ethan at the market." Eleanor looked up from the book she was reading. "And what was he doing?" "Working." The old woman tilted her head with curiosity. "Working?" "Loading boxes for the vendors." Eleanor closed the book calmly. "Well?" Dorothy sat across from her. "I don't think he's doing it to impress you. He looked different." Eleanor remained silent. Dorothy sighed. Look, friend, I know what Ethan did was unforgivable, but something tells me he's really trying to change. Eleanor pressed her lips together. And what do you want me to do, Dorothy? Hug him and tell him everything is okay? No, but maybe you could give him a chance. Eleanor looked away. Did Ethan really deserve a second chance? She had closed the door in his face because she knew words weren't enough. If he had really changed, he had to prove it. Not with empty promises, but with actions. The days passed. Ethan continued to work at the market. At first, the other workers looked at him with suspicion, but gradually they began to accept him. He wasn't the same arrogant man he had been before. He no longer wore expensive suits, no longer spoke with contempt. Now, he was just one of them. And for the first time in his life, he felt useful in a real way. One day, a vendor offered him a hot lunch. You've earned it, kid. Ethan accepted the plate with a sincere smile. Maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. Maybe there was still hope. But the real test was yet to come. Because one afternoon, as he was finishing his shift, he saw Eleanor at the market. He froze for a moment. She saw him, but she didn't approach. She didn't call him. She simply watched him in silence. And Ethan knew that his judgment wasn't over yet. The question still hung in the air. Would she forgive him? The sun began to set behind the buildings as Ethan finished his day at the market. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and sighed. His muscles ached after days of carrying boxes, but it was a different kind of pain that came from honest effort. He had gotten used to waking up early, working without complaint, and earning every penny with the sweat of his brow. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to pay for a small room and eat without depending on anyone. Despite everything he had lost, for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something right. But there was something that still tormented him, his mother. Since that night, Eleanor closed the door in his face. Ethan hadn't tried to talk to her again. He knew words wouldn't work, that he had to prove with actions that he had changed. But would it be enough? That day, as he finished his shift, he was packing his things when he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, and his heart leaped. It was Eleanor. She was wearing her blue coat, and her hair was elegantly tied up, but what surprised him most was the expression on her face. There was no coldness, but no tenderness either. She simply looked at him calmly, as if she were analyzing him. Ethan felt time stand still. Mom. Eleanor tilted her head. You've been working here for weeks. Ethan swallowed. Yes. And you didn't think to come find me? He sighed. I thought about it, but I knew you were right, Eleanor. That words weren't enough. Eleanor remained silent. Ethan took a deep breath. I don't want you to think I'm here to ask you for anything. I don't want money, or the house, or anything. I just wanted to show you that I can be a better person. Eleanor's eyes shone with an emotion Ethan couldn't decipher. After a few seconds, she smiled slightly. Maybe there's hope for you after all. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Does that mean you forgive me? Eleanor took a deep breath. It means I'm willing to try. A huge weight fell from Ethan's shoulders. But before he could speak, his mother held up a hand. On conditions. He nodded quickly. Anything. Eleanor looked at him firmly. If you want to be part of my life again, you'll have to earn it. Ethan pressed his lips together and nodded. I will. It won't be easy, she continued, because even if I forgive you, I will never forget what you did to me. Ethan looked down. I know. Eleanor sighed and extended a hand. Then let's start over. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. But then, with his heart pounding, he took his mother's hand carefully, as if afraid it was all a dream. It was real. Eleanor was giving him a second chance. Days later, Eleanor organized a gathering at her house. After hearing about the ordeal, Grace had taken the first flight she could to be by her sister's side, bringing her daughter Lisa with her. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the comforting strength of her entire family. But this time, it wasn't just Ethan. Dorothy was there, her sister Grace, and her niece Lisa, whom she hadn't seen in years. Eleanor's real family people who had never abandoned her, who were always there even when she felt most alone. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and lively conversation. Ethan watched everything in silence, with a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. He had lost a fake family, but he was rediscovering his real one. He turned to Eleanor and smiled shyly. "Thanks for letting me be here." She returned the smile, but with a warning in her eyes. "You still have a lot to prove, Ethan." He nodded firmly. "I know, and I will." Meanwhile, somewhere else in the city, Victoria slinked through the shadows, a cap covering her face, her eyes filled with resentment. No one knew exactly where she was after being released on bail. She had disappeared off the radar, but if one thing was clear, it was that she hadn't learned her lesson. And at some point, she would try to come back. Eleanor's house was full of life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sweet bread floated in the air, mixing with the laughter and lively conversations of her guests. The living room, which for so long had been a place of sadness and betrayal, now overflowed with warmth. It was a celebration, but not just any celebration. It was the celebration of a woman who had overcome all adversity. Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, watching with a smile, as her home filled with people who truly loved her. Her sister Grace chatted with Dorothy in the kitchen, exchanging stories of their youth between laughs. Lisa, her niece, set the table with care, making sure everyone had something to drink and eat. And most surprisingly of all, Ethan was there. Not as the arrogant, selfish man he once was, but as someone changed, someone who was learning. He was playing with the children in the living room, laughing genuinely as he carried one of his nephews on his shoulders, who was shouting with excitement. Eleanor watched him closely. She knew there was still a long way to go. She knew the past couldn't be easily erased. But at that moment, what she saw wasn't the son who had betrayed her. It was the boy he once was, the boy who would run through the house with a smile full of life. Maybe, just maybe, that boy was still there, waiting for a new chance. Beneath the thunderous applause, Eleanor merely smiled faintly, a gentle smile, no longer burdened by the wounds of the past. There was a time when every compliment felt like a blade twisting into the scars she kept hidden. But today, amidst the loving gazes of her family and friends, she understood. Those scars were not meant to be forgotten, but to be remembered, as proof that she had overcome. She raised her glass, her gaze lingering on each familiar face. "Fate cannot erase what has happened," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But it gives us the strength to write a new chapter, stronger and brighter." Those words were not a declaration, but the culmination of a journey of growth. As the glasses gently clinked, Eleanor knew. A new beginning was arriving, not through forgetting, but with a heart that had learned to heal itself. And that was the conclusion to the story of Eleanor, the woman who was once hurt, betrayed, and abandoned, but who ultimately stood up, found justice, in her own time. What about you? Would you forgive Ethan? Do you think Victoria will return? Life always has unexpected turns, and Eleanor has taught us that no one can escape destiny, but we can choose how to face it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite part was, and share. What ending would you choose for Victoria? Thank you for watching to the very end. See you in the next stories, where emotions are always given a voice.